I'm Sarah Vaughan, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Sarah Vaughan.
It's episode 290 of the Author Stories Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I hope your 2018 is shaping up to be the best year so far. I know it's shaping up to be a great year here at the Author Stories Podcast. Before we get into our great interview today, I'd like to tell you about some sponsors. Crystal Pico Watanabe at Pico's House is one of the very best editors I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. Crystal offers developmental editing, line editing, and beta reading. She's booking for March right now, so inquire early. Go ahead and send her an email. She has 4 proofreaders on staff, so she can usually accommodate authors with a much shorter lead time. She comes highly recommended by authors such as Hugh Howey and Samuel Peralta. Most of her experience is with science fiction, speculative fiction, and middle grade fantasy, but she's a master of all, so be sure to reach out to her. Also, she's got something cool that she's doing now. She's currently recruiting for her NetGalley co-op. Authors who have new book releases or have old books they could use some review love can rent 1, 6, or 12-month slots and put up to a book a month on NetGalley's catalog, which now has its own dedicated United Kingdom site. So check out the link in the show notes to Pico's House. There's an awesome new anthology out from my friend Armand Rosamilia. It's called My Favorite Story Podcast Author Anthology. Project Entertainment Network presents My Favorite Story. 15 podcast hosts and authors share their favorite short stories they've ever written. Stories by Christopher Golden, Brian King, James A. Moore, J. Wilburn, Chuck Buda, Armand Rosamilia, and more. Check out this collection of stories presented by podcast hosts and authors. You're going to love this. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, check out my friend Daniel Kinney, who writes some of the very best middle grade fiction. If you're looking for the perfect gift for those younger readers, he's an amazing writer. He's been on the show before, and he's hilarious. And he writes books that really grab kids' attention. I can't say enough wonderful things about Dan Kinney. There's a link down in the show notes. We're going to be talking more specifically about some of his books in the coming shows, but you're going to love Daniel Kinney. Go pick up some of his middle grade readers for those youngsters in your life. Also, Patricia Gilliam, she's one of my favorite science fiction writers. There's a link down in the show notes where you can go visit her author page. She has a long-running series. If you're looking to get into some great new science fiction reading in the new year, you cannot go wrong with picking up some from Patricia Gilliam. As always, we have an audiobook clip at the end of the show from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Thanks for listening. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Sarah Vaughan on the show. She has a brand new book that's just about to release here in the States, and it is called Anatomy of a Scandal. I have an advanced reader copy that I've been reading for a little while, and it is amazing. I can't wait for everybody to get their hands on this book, and I'm really excited to talk to you today. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Lovely to be here, thank you.
Sarah, I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Well, I actually won a prize when I was 10 years old in 1983. I've written stories. I loved reading. I was that child with a nose in a book the whole time. I think probably at that stage I was devouring Laura Ingalls Wilder, The Little House on the Prairie books. Anyway, my mum encouraged me to go in for this local writing competition, and it was called Devon Young Writer of the Year. Devon is a county where I was brought up. It's much smaller than a state, but it's still quite a sizable tract of British countryside. And the prize for this competition was a £50 in booklets, £75 in cash, and a trip to a publishing house. Anyway, I won it at the age of 10. I wrote a story about some Neolithic standing stones in Cornwall and the sort of witchcraft circle that was going on there. We'd gone camping in a very remote bit of West Cornwall, sticking right out in the Atlantic, and there had been these standing stones there, and it obviously really caught my imagination. And I also wrote a sort of satire on two pot ladies, so I'd submitted both of these, and I won from the sort of the suspense-filled, Cornish mystery. I won the prize, and in those days, £50 book vouchers was an awful lot of books, and I bought as many Judy Blooms as my mum would let me buy, and she insisted, I think I probably moved on to Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret by then, and she insisted, although I didn't understand half of it, and she insisted that I bought a Le-bound set of Jane Austens, which of course I didn't want to at the time, but little did I know that, at 13 I'd be reading those Jane Austens, and eventually, actually, by reading them, I got into a conversation with a professor, just completely conscientiously of English at Oxford, and she recommended to my mum. I applied there. Winning that prize and getting all those books was the way forward. And with the money, I bought a Roberts radio, and a typewriter. So I clearly had aspirations to become a journalist or a writer at that time. But the funny thing is that having had this sort of outpouring and written these stories that won this prize, I can then remember my fearing that my imagination was drying up. And I think I'd had a sort of, I'd had an imaginary friend, I, chatted away and thought of stories all the time, but I was also quite an academic child. So as I turned sort of 11, 12, 13 and facts and be quite important in exams and things, I stopped writing. And I didn't start writing fiction again until into my 40th, the week that I turned 40 really, or just before my 40th birthday, and I committed to writing a novel at my 40th birthday. I became a journalist, and I did an English degree, and I knew I wanted to write, but I think I was fearful after that somehow. I think I didn't think I had the right to write fiction or write a novel.
Oh man, what I loved you came back to it, obviously, but what a heartbreaking story that's so passionate about it, and then lost that fire and zeal along the way.
I don't know why it was. I think I was bullied badly at school, and my parents split up when I was 13, and I threw all my creative energy actually into playing the flute. I got my final grade 8. I got a distinction at 13, and I was quite obsessive about that. So I was that sort of high-achieving child who was kind of principal flautist in the county youth orchestra, and by the time I was 17, I was doing sort of 5 or 6 hours practice a day. I thought I wanted to be a professional flautist, and actually then I realised as I did my final school exams when I was 18 that the subject I loved doing was English. That the one I really looked forward to revising was English, and I actually swapped. I'd got into university to read music, and I swapped to read English because I knew that's where my passion was. But I think I kind of, for a moment, transferred my creative energies from one art form to another. And it's funny, I read English at all, which is pertinent to the book, and it didn't occur to me at all that I write fiction, because I do. I think most author I read was Virginia Woolf. I remember being a child and I heard that Zadie Smith was only a couple of years younger than me, and it just didn't women my age could possibly write fiction, and it took a long time before I just thought, that's in book, I'm 40th, but if I don't do it now, it's never get back to what I think I might be quite good at.
For sure. Ghost wrote that was the award winner. Your influence at the time were Largles, Wilder, obviously. Snake Stones and Countryside and Circles. That's kind of...
Yes, it is, and actually, which isn't that was published over in the UK, and actually I sell in North Cornwall, and I wrote hard at Du Maurier before and it's funny, isn't it? I was a teenager. I mean, not quite at 10, but 13, I was reading gay, and obviously sort of devised that. I remember I won a new prize, and I bought Hesky as a surprise. I was going to my English, but everything got rooted in the Cornish country. My number for his it's somewhere I actually love, has that wellness, and all live in the road anyway, that really West Cornwall. I don't say something thinking right. I was even doing it then, that was the starting point for that story. I can't remember what happened with the mystery apart from the group. It was writing words or something we started bound and did it properly. It was the occasion and mystery of the ancient working inside that was always important there.
And so threads of mystery, obviously, are still very important. They come out in one that and mysteries that subversive intrigue below the surface there. You make those two, ancient folk things that mystery that stick your brain tell.
I think I wanted to use an Eddie Hart quote as an epigraph. In fact, it's born book, but it's about the power kept pricking. And that's, I think, what all my books are trying to story, what it was that shaped into me. Carrie's outwardly very successful, and yet something's happened in her, taught her more than she'll confess it, and really get a story simmering along beforehand, and that, obviously all come out. I think now I'm in my mid-40s now. By the time past events do happen, and that tension and suspense is equal in a novel.
Right. To Oxford, reading English. What's your intention there with your studies, and where did you see yourself with that?
Well, I think what I wanted to do, and I realised when I was 18, so I didn't do that, but I wanted to, English was my favourite subject, and pretty quickly I got into not only playing in orchestras there, but the newspaper, the Story Reviews and Book Reviews and the Bookish. And as I say, because it just didn't occur to me that somebody my age would write a novel, and I wasn't writing fiction at that time. I knew I wanted to write as a career, and I can remember going to the careers office and looking at publishing, actually, and being told, I'm not quite sure why, but having got the impression that you had to have contacts and you had to be quite wealthy to go into publishing. And so I don't know why I thought I could be a journalist, because I had no contacts in journalism either. But I thought I knew I wanted to write, and I thought that I knew I could write, actually. At least I could write arts features. So because I had kind of this passport, I get work experience on Fleet Street newspapers. They're kind of our main newspapers, but also local radio stations and things like that. And in the year after doing my degree, I kind of alternated earning money, £2.90 an hour, which I don't know what that is, like $4 or something an hour, for wiping tables and, being a receptionist and doing pretty pot washing, and things like that in hotels. And then when I'd earned enough, I'd go and work for free as an intern in London, and then I'd come back and wash a few more pots and things. And eventually, by sort of 9 months into doing that, I got a 3-month secondment on the Times newspaper, and they didn't pay me, but they paid my travel expenses, so at least that was something. And as a result of that, I got I applied for a trainee scheme. Now, I didn't get it, but the managing director was impressed with me, so he recommended me to something called the Press Association, which is like Associated Press. I then had a 2-year traineeship there, which was actually fantastic. I'd paid to do a journalism course, which taught me things like shorthand. So I had 110 words per minute in shorthand, and it taught me media law and touch typing and things like that, basic skills, and how to write, a news story for a local paper. And then after 5 months there, I went to work for the Press Association for a couple of years. I did lots and lots of court reporting, which is relevant for this. Partly because I had such fast shorthand, I could be relied on to get all the words down. But also stories like there was an inquest of a black teenager who was murdered by a gang over here, or they were the prime suspects in the case, and that was a big story over here, so I did that. I did a bombing. I got sent to Northern Ireland, and a riot went off, and I did. Unfortunately, I had because I was perceived as quite sympathetic, I unfortunately started to do crime cases as well, in which, I wouldn't be perceived as being threatening or difficult to the families. But that happened more with The Guardian when I was 25. So yeah, that was my career. But I didn't actually think when I was doing my English degree in any way I could be an author. But writing novels was something that dead white men did, and I think if you wanted to do women's fiction, it was a separate specialist paper, and perhaps that wasn't seen as I think I did T.S. Eliot or something. Oh, I did the novel. That's it. I did a paper on the novel. You could do a paper on women's fiction, or you could do a paper on the novel. So I chose the novel instead. So perhaps I knew on some level, but I certainly did. Literature was John Milton and Shakespeare. It wasn't me.
Looking back now on the time that you spent as a journalist and covering stories and court reporting and all of those skills that you acquired along the way, how do you feel like they have affected you as a novelist, and what tools do you think you picked up that have benefited you as a novelist that maybe you didn't realize at the time when you were going through them?
Well, funnily enough, I've just written a whole blog on this for Waterstones Booksellers over here, so I'm equipped to answer this question. So I think the first thing I learnt was about the drama of court. So I referred to that inquest into the black teenager Stephen Lawrence, which was in February 2024, and I was at the starting point. I was the only member of the press, and I was writing at this very old-fashioned Victorian press desk in front of one of these gang members who had not been able to be brought to trial, but who they were suspects. And this gang had kept mentions the court not answer questions, so he could something called, I'm just giving the word, the right of privilege, so incriminate himself. So every question, he could say, I claim privilege, and it even to the point where his artist he'd say, I claim privilege. And the QC was, asking the questions, conveyed a sense of just by relentless, rhythmic, hypnotic almost rhythm of questions. And the young men, of 5 of them, by their stonewalling and their swagger, they conveyed their sort of lack of compassion and sort of exposed themselves really as possible. Attention in that old Victorian courtroom, it was only the opening of an inquest, but you could have, it's a cliche, you could have cut it with a knife. It was really, really taut, this sort of rhythmic, deep, resonant voice of the QC and the sort of the swagger of the boys in return. And that, very early on, a year into my career, taught me how dramatic a court case could be. And I then covered things like there was a little girl who was and I covered her disappearance and the trial of the paedophile who did it, and I covered cases in the High Courts. I covered one of the very early, it was a DJ who was accused and found guilty of sexually assaulting young boys, and in all those instances, in these big dramatic Victorian courtrooms, it's not just the way in which barristers dress or speak or the whole paraphernalia of how it's set up, it's the adversarial nature of it, and it's that extremes of emotion. There were really high stakes in the courtroom. You can go to prison, can't you? You can be found guilty of murder or of killing a child or of raping somebody. So there are real extremes of emotion. You see people at their most stark, I think, and you're also aware of how a story can twist on a little detail. The narrative can veer off in a different direction, or can turn on a comment. Or if, a good barrister should know the answer to the question that they're on. But sometimes someone betrays themselves in the way in which a comment comes out, or a witness will say something which couldn't really have been made up or couldn't have been fabricated, and you'll get a little glimpse then of the heart of the issue then. So courtroom reporting taught me that. When I moved to the Guardian, I did lots of court reporting, and as I say, lots of disappearances of not lots of disappearances of children, but cases like this. On a major news story also taught me how stories develop and gain momentum and twist and turn in different directions. I think my best example of that was in 2002. I covered a story at the Soham, and these were 2 schoolgirls who were 10, and they disappeared one August. I think it was an August bank holiday, or it was an August weekend after a family barbecue, and I think it possibly caught the attention of everybody over here because it was quite a quiet season. MPs were on holiday and things, and also because they were these beautiful looking little girls who disappeared one golden sunshine, one golden evening from a Cambridgeshire village, a very remote rural area. Anyway, we all decamped up to Soham, and for 11 days we were kind of camped at the school where they'd gone missing, and the school caretaker kind of would let us in for police press conferences, and we were all sort of based in this very small village town. And 11 days after they disappeared, this caretaker, Ian Huntley, told a journalist colleague of mine he might have been the last person to see these girls alive. And this colleague of mine was a bit suspicious because he then didn't want his photo taken at all, and very wary of being filmed. And this was because he was known to the police in an area. At the time, he didn't have any between police forces here, if an alleged offender had done something. But he realised that if his picture was put on national news, other police forces might say, hang on a minute, we questioned him about a rape and underage sex, in our force. Anyway, he got very shifty, and the 2 journalists, I think, went to the police. And the next day, 12 days after the girl's disappearance, the police called a press conference to say that a man had been arrested, and we who'd all interviewed him and been on his site and been in a way manipulated by him because he'd determined when the school was locked up, or, this was 2002, phone connections weren't as good, we were quite dependent on being based there to file our copy and things like that. We realised it was this guy Ian Huntley, and working on a case like that for 2 weeks and being based there and seeing all these characters taught you how it could develop, how it could, a story could go down cul-de-sacs and dead ends, and then just that comment, I might have been the last person to see them. He almost got carried away by his cockiness, I think. and then the fear of being photographed or filmed and not retracting but retreating when that was brought up, twisted the story really, and that was what powered the police to investigate him and arrest him. And finally, I then went after doing so, I actually thought I can't have it any more of these crime cases involving young children. At some point I want to have children. I can't keep writing stories about little girls who are being murdered and abused. I mean, it really felt a very visceral feeling. I applied to be a political correspondent. I'd already been a parliamentary correspondent for 6 months of my training, and I'd done a maternity leave for a colleague, and I'd loved it. And then when this colleague had her second baby, I managed to get her job, and that was brilliant. And it was working in the lobby that taught me about charismatic, psychologically complex characters again, how truth can be obscured, how, nuance of language is so important. And the theatre of the courtroom, I suppose, was replaced by the theatre of the Commons chamber. So there were still very high stakes. It's not prison, but it's reputation. There were really robust egos here. And I saw lots of moments of high tension then. So I saw resignations of cabinet ministers. I saw the debate about whether we should go to war with Iraq over the weapons inspector's report, and I was with Tony Blair on a foreign trip when the news broke that the former weapons inspector, Dr. David Kelly, had apparently committed suicide, and a tabloid journalist asked him, have you got blood on your hands or something like that, and I watched the sort of, the blood drain from his face as he was asked that, so I saw these real sort of moments of high tension. I also saw how sex scandals involving politicians broke and were played out. So all of that, without realising it, was fantastic material and experience for then writing a novel set in Westminster, but also working out about twists and suspense and cliffhangers and secrets and all those things which hopefully make for a compelling novel.
Yeah, it's so interesting that when you're in the midst of these things and you're collecting these life experiences, you don't always know what they're going to culminate in. And it's so interesting to look back and say, yes, I learned this from this experience, and I picked this up from here. It's probably better that way, because if we did know, we would probably screw it up along the way a bit.
We would, and I think you're so busy when you're doing a story like covering the Sower murders. I mean, you're working very long hours. If you're a bit of a perfectionist like me, and you're young and you're keen, you're kind of at the beck and call of your news desk, and you're completely focused on what you're doing. It's pretty intense, and I don't think at any moment, and obviously you're thinking about on a very human level, I was thinking about, we saw the parents of these girls, and you're sort of worrying about, pretty early on these girls are probably going to be dead. But, so there's a sort of, although it's a big story and that's exciting being on a big story, you've also got that sort of underlying sadness as well. And I remember coming back from covering the Sarah murders, and it's kind of taken quite a toll on me as well. I'd kind of just felt quite physically drained, and I'd lost weight because, you were on the job for 2 weeks, not eating necessarily that well, long hours. And a colleague saying to me, well, obviously you have to write about it now. You've got the inside story. You can write a non-fiction book about it. And again, I was like, oh, no, because, I wouldn't write a book, would I? I wasn't going to write a book. But I think probably on some level I just didn't want to. I've always said I don't think I could write a novel about a child who's abducted, although clearly I have the experience of how police handle that, and that would in a way perhaps be, on one level, perhaps would be an easier novel to write. Although I don't think it would be easier emotionally. I think I'd find that very draining. But you're right, I wasn't consciously thinking in any way, I might put that in a novel at some point. And I wasn't even trying to write fiction. I think when I was a news reporter, my style of writing was so different because, you're trying to encapsulate the germ of the story in the first sentence, and certainly in the first three sentences, the first three paragraphs. And that's a big difference than writing novels, not sort of throwing it all in the first chapter. And it was actually, after I had my second child, I had this sounds like a tangent, but it's not, it's relevant, honestly. After I had my second child, I had a very difficult pregnancy and I couldn't walk during it. And we'd also moved outside London for my husband's job. And so when it came to going back to work at The Guardian after I had my second child, I physically couldn't do it. So I took redundancy, which at the time felt like a complete failure. But I then took 2 years off when I brought up my little children and renovated a house and kind of just let myself sort of, enjoy or cope with small children, and then started freelancing when my youngest was 2, and hated that. So I was writing again, but I was writing for features and hating it. But I think what was really crucial about that time was it gave me a break from doing news stories, and it let my mind just be free of writing in that very structured, newsworthy, factual way. And I started doing sort of creative things with my kids, and I started letting my imagination, I suppose, run riot again with the idea for my first novel, which was very much about motherhood and was born from having that time off with my children. And I think I'd almost needed a break from news stories to be able to allow myself to write fiction and write creatively, because when I was in the moment of writing like that, I don't think I had the headspace to do a different style of writing or to allow my imagination. You know, my head was so, particularly when I was doing politics, my head was so full of political facts and agendas and, you know, thoughts that there was no room for anything imaginative or creative.
Well, I totally agree with that, and that sometimes you're so deep into something that there's no room to explore anything else because you're just inundated with it. And I'm kind of afraid that our current social media culture, where we're inundated with news and facts and stories constantly, that we aren't giving ourselves a break from things to really ponder and contemplate and allow our creative self to have room to express, because we're just always so keyed up about whatever the latest scandal is or the latest I don't know. I think it's separating yourself and going and just really putting yourself in a different headspace is great for creativity.
Yeah, I totally agree. In fact, I was just thinking this morning, I'm editing my 4th novel, the follow-up to this, and I was just thinking, do you know what, I just need a break, complete break from social media, because, I'm expected to do, I enjoy Twitter, but it's also, you're flitting on it all the time, you're responding to things, you're not in the moment of writing because you're thinking, I must just check that, or I must engage with that, or I'll just see what's happening on Twitter, or, and I think I'm just, it's not good for having that focus. And I see that actually with my kids. My youngest is 9 and he likes going on the iPad, and I will take it off them and I will say, when I was your age, I just read a novel. But I mean, that just being immersed in a novel, they don't tend to do as much. In fact, he's been off ill today, as we were saying, and I refused to let him have it this morning. I said, no, you can read a book. And he said, I've just read a book this morning. And I thought, actually, he needs to have that time to do that. We all need that time just to immerse ourselves in books, or just to not think about anything. This year we've got a puppy, and in a way that's another huge demand on my time. But the really good thing is I have to do an hour's walk with her in the morning, and I start off, checking Twitter, checking emails as I'm walking her. And then recently I've just been switching my phone off, putting it in the bottom of the bag and refusing to let myself look at it while I take that hour's walk. And it's really lovely actually just having that headspace. I might not even be thinking about what I'm going to be writing that day. I mean, I would hope I'm thinking about what I'm writing that day, but sometimes I'm just really conscious that my mind is emptying, or, I'm just mulling over concerns of my children or Christmas presents or all the other things that I have to think about. But I think that emptiness away from a phone is really, away from the net, is really healthy, and that's going to be my resolution for the new year, to do a lot more of that. Because I can remember as a child being really bored. I think I do sound like a geriatric person now, but I can remember, summer holidays just lying on the floor saying, I'm so bored. But I did create these sort of imaginative worlds. My sister and I had these imaginative worlds where we were mummies with babies, and, we had this whole sort of life that went on. And my boy does it with his Lego figures, and but I worry that some children don't do it in the same way nowadays. I mean, my daughter had a doll's house, and my son builds a whole Lego village, and he enacts things. He's got a Donald Trump minifigure at the moment, and he enacts factual things that are happening with his minifigures. So his imagination plays in that way. But I think it's really important to restrict screen time and things to allow the brain to work in different ways.
Yeah, I completely agree. you talked about having that time away from journalism allowed you to switch gears away from reporting and getting the the essential facts and allowing yourself to kind of become creative again in the sense of creating stories. But you said earlier that there was sort of a block in your mind that you could write fiction, that was reserved for other people.
Yeah.
And you had to have certain qualifications and qualities to write fiction. So what happened with you, not only shifting gears from writing nonfiction reporting to fiction, but what happened in you that allowed you to realize that you were qualified to write fiction?
That's a really interesting question. Do you know what? I think I'd not hit rock bottom, but I think career-wise, I was having to reappraise what I was going to do. So I'd always been this nauseating high achiever, won my creative writing competition at the age of 10, straight A's, went to Oxford, bar 6 months wiping tables, kind of, got my journalism internships and then got the job at the Guardian, got a traineeship at 23 and got the job at the Guardian at 25. So everything had all, me. And then I had my second child at 35 and just had this awful condition where I couldn't walk at all from sort of 19 weeks of the pregnancy. And really until he was about 3 was in an awful lot of pain. And we'd moved from London to an area outside London called Cambridge, but it's a big commute in if you've got little kids, and from my husband's job, and really circumstances conspired to ensure that I couldn't really go back to working on the Guardian. The hours that you're required to do as a news reporter, I would have needed a full-time live-in nanny. By the time I'd paid for that and the commute, I would never have seen my kids, and I'd have been running at a loss. So something in a way had to give, and in a way that they were looking for people to take redundancy, and in a way that gave me permission to just take a break and to say, look, I've had 15 years of or 13 years on Fleet Street. I kind of need. I want to be here for my kids. I want a bit of a break. And I thought I'd freelance, but I actually found freelancing really soul destroying because I'd had a whizzy high-powered job where I'd been taking ministers out for lunch, and then even when I stopped doing that, I was they knew I could write and I was experienced, so I got before. And sitting at a desk sending stories off to largely women's magazines. I was writing for Mother and Baby magazine about breastfeeding and things like that. And have a copy hacked around and having to almost sort of, prostitute is a wrong word, what I like, but solicit stories, sort of trying to sell yourself all the time. That I'm quite self-deprecating. That doesn't come very easily to me. I was used to being in an environment where there were stories to be found, not trying to think up features ideas and flog them to a features desk that might not be very interested in you. So I think I just, and I was aware that my 40th birthday was looming, and I think I just thought, you know what, it's now or never. I've got to do something that I've got. I want to be here with my children. My husband's a surgeon, so he's working in an NHS hospital. He's not around very much. And the thing I really want to do is write. And being with my kids, doing very domestic things, I did a lot of baking with my children. And there's a program which I think you have over there on PBS. It's called the Great British Bake Off over here. And it became a sort of water cooler program. People got obsessed with it. And at the same time, I was noticing why mothers at the school gate were being very competitive about their cake sales. And I started thinking, why are they being so? It really came from this. Why are people being so obsessed with baking? And I sort of span a story about how actually it's all about perfectionism and the impossibility of perfection and love, really, and the different reasons that people might bake. And one of which was quite dark. One of my characters had a eating disorder, and there was a flick of sexual assault in the past. And so clearly, even from this baking novel, there was darkness looming. And I sort of span a novel from that. But I think it was actually being reduced to a state where I wasn't this sort of golden book girl anymore. I was at home with 2 little children, feeling probably quite rubbish about myself, if I'm honest, because I wasn't being a high flyer anymore, and I was riddled with that sort of doubt that I think can come when you're at home with your kids and you think, I'm not being a good enough mother, and I'm not using my brain in the way I used to use, and the sort of, much as I adored them, the frustration of that, and the frustration of writing these pieces for Mother and Baby magazine about breastfeeding or whatever else I was writing about, which is all very laudable, but it wasn't what I wanted to do long term. So I think maybe at that stage, and maybe I started to look around and think, actually, not everybody reads, Virginia Woolf's The Waves. I'm not seeing people around me at the school gate discussing, T.S. Eliot or even Jane Austen or, Dickens. They're sort of reading contemporary fiction, and I mean, obviously I read contemporary fiction as well, but I'm simplifying a bit. But, the recognition that actually perhaps I had something to... I think that there's an element of that as well, actually. So the week that my youngest started school, he started school on a Monday, and on the Thursday I turned 40. And I really think it was a sort of now or never moment, and I stood up at a party with some girlfriends, a meal I was having, and they said, what are you going to do this year? And I drunkenly announced that I was going to write a novel and get it published within a year. And I think it was really important that I kind of made that announcement, because it made me accountable. I'd kind of said it. And then the really lovely thing was that at the school gate, nobody said, oh, you were a bit tipsy the other night, what were you talking about there? People would say, how's the novel coming on? Because they knew I was writing features, and they knew I had an idea, and and they knew I often looked a bit preoccupied, I think. And so they'd be saying, how's it coming on? So then I'd say, I've sent it off to an agent, and I had no idea how difficult it was to get a novel published. But they were all very supportive, because they'd been there at the beginning, and nobody seemed, or nobody articulated their doubts. They may well have thought it, but, they didn't say it to me. So I think, to answer your question in a very roundabout way, sorry, I think I'd probably come to the end of my journalistic career in the form it was, in the form of being a news reporter doing in a very buzzy atmosphere. I knew I couldn't reprise that. I couldn't get that back when I had small children, so I knew I needed to do something else, something practically. And I had, because I'd allowed myself this sort of break, and I'd been lucky because I've had this redundancy money, and I was lucky my husband supported me too. My brain, kind of, the stories came back, and I felt that I had something to say. And I think maybe at 40, I kind of thought, actually I've done all right. I've got 2 kids, I've got a husband, I've got a house, I've got, I've had a really good career. But I'm only 40, what am I going to do now? And actually, if I don't do it now, I don't want to get to 50 and not have done it. I need to grab it and get on with it. So I think that was a real sort of monumental birthday was quite important. But also the sense that I'd kind of not burnt my bridges, but I'd ended one career and I needed to see how else I could write. So I suppose an element of desperation really came into that, yeah.
And sometimes kind of being at the end of the line is a real gift, when you can't easily go back, and I might as well do the thing that I've kind of always dreamt about. Yeah. Yeah,
and I was looking at doing what's called a PhD. So it's a qualification, so you can become a teacher, and you have to pay to do it over here and things. And I was thinking, well, that's the obvious thing to do, isn't it, to go and teach? And then I was thinking, well, my mum was an English teacher, my sister's a teacher, my in-laws are teachers, Nobody seems particularly happy being a teacher. Nobody thinks I'm a natural teacher. I'd probably only, if I'm honest, I'd probably only want to teach bright A-level students who had a real passion for English, and I wouldn't be able to pick and choose that. I'd also be teaching the 14-year-old boys who really didn't want to be reading To Kill a Mockingbird or whatever else they might be reading, So I thought, I don't actually really want to do this. And interestingly, I was looking at the PGCE course details and the application form and the cost when my agent, who I'd written to on spec, rang, and I answered the phone, and I was on my computer looking at it thinking, I've written 66,000 words of this novel, but no one's going to publish it. Perhaps I better just face reality and apply to do this traineeship, and then we'll have some money coming in. And my agent rang, or she wasn't my agent at the time. She was this woman who said, hello, you sent me your book. And I sort of took that as a sign that, she had some faith in me, and she worked on me actually for the next 9 months, and then we sold it then. So, that was my sign that was meant to be, that I wasn't meant to be a teacher.
and what a fortuitous sign it turned out to be.
Yeah, it was.
The new book, Anatomy of a Scandal. How did you? Because you were writing more. I don't know what that. Yeah, women's fiction.
Women's fiction.
This, and this book is a little bit of that, but it's definite courtroom drama, thriller, suspense, mystery. How did this book come about?
Well, my first book, which was called The Art of Baking Blind, was very much born out of being at home with my two children and thinking about motherhood and the impossibility of perfection. And, remember I stood up with my friends, were going to get it, published within a year, so I probably wasn't over-ambitious with it. Very much a book that was written when my kids were, 4 and 7 or 5 and 8, and it was very much where I was at that moment. And I sold it within 30 months of that birthday, and I sold it to 10 countries actually. And with my English publishers, my UK publishers, it was a 2-book deal. So they said, come up with an idea for the next one, and I came up with the idea of Anatomy as the next one. And they kind of went, not unreasonably, they said, that's a bit of a jump from baking to a novel about consent. So you have to write something else in between. So then I wrote my novel set in North Cornwall, which is about love, loss and atonement, and it's got a backstory set in the Second World War, and it required lots of sort of historical research. It was my tricky second novel. At one point I ripped out 55,000 words and had to rewrite them, but I learnt an awful lot in writing that. And my editor, who'd bought both the books, actually left before the paperback of the first one came out, and there were lots of changes. And so when I'd finished writing the second novel, I was out of contract, and I wasn't sort of actively pursuing a new contract with them because I just needed a bit of space to write this novel that I really wanted to write, Anatomy of a Scandal. And so I decided with my agent that I would just write it and see if they wanted it, because there was lots of sort of personnel changes and things. And it was wonderful actually writing it out of contract. Contract's brilliant in that you're going to get paid. But this was quite freeing because I was writing the story I wanted to write. And the honest truth is I came up with the idea of this story in November 2013, so 4 years ago. And it marries lots of different elements of my life. I actually dreamed up the book. I had a dream, and which has never happened since, and I really want it to happen with another novel. I'd been having a discussion with a couple of girlfriends about a footballer over here who, at the time, was refused leave to appeal against a rape conviction. And I had quite an energetic debate with these two girlfriends, both of whom had daughters, and both of whom I felt were a bit critical of the girl in the case. And I suppose I started to think about what we would now call our Me Too moments, but, which we didn't voice then. And I suppose I was a bit jangled when I went to sleep. And I just dreamt up this idea of a very charismatic politician. I knew he was probably going to be a Tory because I wanted that sort of sense of a very entitled young man to come through. And that's a big generalisation, but I pinpointed it with that particular party. And I wanted him to have been having an affair. It was important that it wasn't just somebody random, that it wasn't a sort of stranger case, but he'd been having an affair with somebody, and then something happens at the heart of the House of Parliament, and he's accused of a crime. And I think probably this book was so relatively easy to write for me because it marries that experience of working in the lobby, the experience of covering court cases, and my experience of having a student, because that's where the backstory is. And so, in a way, it's certainly the most personal of my novels, and in a way, I could just bring in all those three elements of my life, and the Oxford bits kind of not wrote themselves, but they were very much, I could draw on having felt like a sort of unsophisticated provincial outsider, I could draw on that very easily for those bits. So I think this was the novel that I didn't have the confidence or didn't think of when I was at home with my little kids, because I was immersed in the moment of making cakes and wondering about motherhood and perfectionism and failures and, childbirth and all the things that come into the first novel. But this novel that I had been dying to write for 2 years before I actually started writing it. And it's the novel that brings in disparate parts of, my past, really, and so it's been the easiest thing. So it's not but I would say, because a lot of people said to me, it's a big jump from a novel about baking. But the first novel does have that. It does have a somber backstory with a character who purports to be perfect, but actually has a great sadness. So that sort of undercuts the very public image. And it also has, as I said, a character who has an eating disorder, and there's a couple of sort of flicks of abuse in that respect. And the second novel has a very dark, something that happens on Bodmin Moor that's very dark. And again, I'm sure no one's going to go and read this, so I can say it again. It was actually a sort of child assault thing that happens then. So and I went back, read a lot of Du Maurier again, and went back and kind of got lost on the moor to try and conjure up that sense of dread and there. So I think you could actually see this issue that I'm exploring in the third novel has sort of been simmering away in the two previous ones, and I clearly wanted to explore it a bit more. I was talking to a friend who obviously hasn't read the third one at the weekend, and he said, I think you do darkness really well in your first two books, so that's why I'm really interested in the third one, because they're the bit that really gripped me in the first books. So she saw it as a continuation. She saw that this third book is basically what I hadn't been enough to do from the start.
I love that kind of shedding the notions of and getting down to what you really want to write. Those first two novels obviously were what you wanted to write in the time, but this was the thing that you were really passionate about. And not being under contract, you mentioned that was really freeing, that you could write without anyone else's input in the creative portion of writing it. This book is very immediate. You wrote it in first person present tense, which when you open the first page, you're immediately dropped right into this character's
they're not
thoughts.
It's not all first person. One of Kate is first person, but Sophie is, and James is third person. But you start with the first person present.
Yes, you're dropped right into the story. And what was your kind of decision process for deciding to begin the book that way and to carry her viewpoint through the book that way?
I think when I dreamed my story, she was my starting point. This character Kate, and I don't want to create spoilers by saying why it's important that we start with her. But for me, her story was the thing that drove it through. And Sophie, it was clear that her story was going to be important as well, but my sympathies, I guess, were more with Kate. And so I suppose that decision to write in the first person, which I'd never tried before, I'm doing it in my fourth book as well, but I'd never tried it before, and I think I wanted to try that, that immediacy that you get with a first person present and with starting with a character like that. And also she's what I really loved about creating her was she's not, I don't think, a sort of character that you often get in women's fictional or suspense, because she's a really bright professional woman, and it was just a delight to take on the role almost of a barrister, which she is, and have that confident voice. Although of course we discover she isn't, as she is outwardly successful, but that she has her own demons as well. But it was just so freeing to take on that persona, as to narrate it and to write it as this very articulate, ballsy woman, really. But that's a contradiction in terms, isn't it? I don't want to say feisty, because that's not the right word for her, but forceful, strong woman, and so I think she demanded a first person and an immediacy in that respect. I think I'd read 7 books on the trot that were in first person print, and so I sort of picked, there's a bit of a trend here, perhaps this is something I should try, and it seemed to fit. I don't think I'll want to write in first person all the time. I think it can be very limiting, but
right.
For her it worked, or at least I hope it worked. It felt like it worked.
Well, and having the other viewpoint characters to swap over really, you find yourself looking forward to getting back into her head.
Good.
But then, appreciating when you get out and see the story from other perspectives. Like it's a really a great way to do that. It really works.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Thank you. Well, I've tried that with my next novel. I've got a first person who's a paediatrician, so she's another strong character, so she's a children's doctor, and then the third person are parents in the case, and they're also very important. In fact, I've sort of alternated more between the two viewpoints, but it's very restricting, I think, if you just have a first person narrator all the way through, because obviously there's nuance in a story like this where it's about different interpretations of events. You need more than one person's point of view, don't you? I didn't want to be limiting and restricting. I mean, there are examples of books, where it's like Notes on a Scandal or Lie With Me recently. It's just the first person narrator, and it works incredibly well because it's, a narrator. But I didn't just want to restrict myself to one person's viewpoint here. That's why I've got the third person chapters as well.
Right. In writing this book, you said that it began with a dream, and that it's not happened to you since. I had a similar thing happen. The first book I wrote came to me fully formed in a dream. It was really crazy, and I've never gotten back to that place again. Like I've had other story ideas drop in, and they're great, but never just fully, realized like that. And I wonder what that is. Like, where do those things come from, I wonder, and when they and it when it happens. It's one of those things that
Interestingly, I think I was under pressure because I knew I had to think of a second novel, and it had been sort of brewing, and I sent off an email to my agent that I just had this amazing dream. What if I wrote a story about this? And 3 minutes later I got an email back going, that's brilliant. I think that's, and then we couldn't because it was too much of a jump from baking. We couldn't have that as my second novel. Actually, I'm glad it's as a third novel. I've learned more, from having got to it in that stage. I don't know. It's never had any sense. I mean, I get sort of ideas, but they're not as fully formed as that. So I guess I need to grasp one of those ideas. And I don't know whether I was in a particularly creative. I'd sold the book, so I wasn't writing anything else. I was just in that slight lull when I think I'd sold the book and I was having to think of another one. And then I managed to think of the idea very quickly and fully realise that within a week. And that was good as well. So I think it's a bit like deadlines. I do respond well to pressure, but that amazing waking up thinking I've got this amazing, almost fully formed. I mean, there were things that were altered, twists that were altered, and Sophie became more important. It became very quickly apparent that it would have to be just from Kate's point. That we wanted to see people almost in a different way, but the nub of the idea and the theme of the book and the main Kate and James characters and what was going to happen in the House of Commons and the outcome and the ending was all there. So yes, please, I need to eat cheese or something. I need to have another one of those pretty quickly.
I love it. Sarah, I want to talk more about this book, but there's anything else we talk about is going to spoil this.
It's hard,
It is. I have danced around questions that I've wanted to ask, and we'll just we'll revisit again one day and talk about the things that we don't want to spoil for people now.
No.
But I really encourage everyone to go pick up a copy of this book. It's called Anatomy of a Scandal by Sarah Vaughan. Sarah, where can people find you if they have been intrigued by your story and want to follow more of what you do?
Brilliant. Well, I am on Twitter as Vaughan author, and I'm on Goodreads, on Facebook, and I have got a website which is www.sarahvaughanauthor, all lowercase, .squarespace.com. But I think if you just put in Sarah Vaughan, sarahvaughanauthor.com, www.sarahvaughanauthor.com, all lowercase. So at the moment, in the UK, there's a blog tour that's going on. So, for instance, yesterday I answered lots of questions about the bounds to the novel. I think tomorrow I've answering more questions as well, and on Friday. You can also find the trailers. The UK have done some stunning trailers, almost like Netflixy type trailers, from Kate and Sophie's viewpoints and sort of whole story viewpoint, and my US publishers have also done one. So there's lots of sort of things on there, and I think there'll be more while it's happening. Yeah, I would say it's difficult writing about it, talking about it without creating spoilers, but I think it's a very pertinent novel, if I can say that at the moment. It's quite topical. I mean, there's even in the UK at the moment, there's actually a trial that started today that's going on, which obviously I didn't know about and happened after I wrote the novel. But, you know, it's that idea of entitlement and abuse of power of successful, charismatic men. I mean, you're seeing it with Weinstein and Hollywood and everything, and, you know, we're seeing it over here as well. So I think I don't think it's a story I don't think it's an issue that's going to go away anytime soon. So hopefully it will resonate in that way. It's certainly something that has preoccupied me a lot. And I've got a daughter who's now 12 and who was 8 when I came up with the idea. And I think I wrote it also hoping that she didn't experience what women in my generation and, you know, generations older than her have experienced as well. If that doesn't give too much away, does that give too much away? I'm being suitably cryptic.
It's perfect. Sarah, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. I've really enjoyed chatting with you.
I've
today.
loved talking to you. It's been really good. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Jason and Joey took their food trays outside and sat high above the parking lot on the secluded stairwell that had become their lunchtime hangout, picking at their Thanksgiving specials and swapping updates. They were almost finished eating before Jason managed to screw up the courage to say what he needed to. "I want to apologize." Joey looked puzzled. "What the hell for?" "Because your coma was my fault." "Yours? The horseman beamed me. You didn't." "Hey, want to see something cool? Look what I found on my phone." Joey produced the device, hit a few buttons, and swiped his finger. An orange circle hung in a field of black, overexposed, something that had been moving fast when the flash caught it. "I was trying to get his picture, right? Like an idiot? Well, I didn't get him, but that is the pumpkin he threw at me." Jason stared at the blurry orange shape for a long time. "Cool. Cool? Can you imagine if we actually got a picture of the Headless Horseman? We'd be famous by now." He pocketed the phone. "Hey, do you want the rest of this turkey? It looks like bologna." "Tastes like bologna, too." He speared the slice anyway. "Look, this is going to sound weird, but I think I made you a target." "What do you mean?" "I made you a target by telling you about my gift. It's some sort of magical rule. If we reveal ourselves to a normal person, whoever we tell becomes a target for ghosts. And usually, they die." "And you told me anyway?" "No, I'd already told you. There was no way to untell you. Don't be mad. It all worked out, right? Right?" Joey's expression had darkened. "Give me a second here. And there's a bright side." "What bright side?" "Now you'll have a gift too." "Me?" "That's what your coma was. Some kind of transition. You got targeted, but you survived. You'll be a founder now, like Ichabod. You'll pass your gift to your kids like he passed his to me." Joey looked worried. "What kind of gift will I get?" "People get gifts that complement their natural abilities. It could be anything." "Anything? So, I could read minds?" "I guess." "Turn purple and levitate?" "Probably not. Something that expresses the essential you." "Then I'll have an actor's gift. What's an actor's gift?" Jason shrugged. "Super narcissism? Shut up. So you're not mad?" Joey was shaking with excitement. "Mad? This is the coolest thing ever! We'll be like the dynamic duo, fighting supernatural foes up and down the eastern seaboard." Jason laughed, feeling epic relief. "I thought you'd be pissed." "Nah. What's a little coma between friends?" He took a bite out of a Nutter Butter, grinning madly. "I'm going to be a superhero." "But you can't tell anyone." "Why not? Weren't you listening? Everyone we tell dies. You can't talk about your gift to anybody." "But if they were targeted and lived, we could have our own X-Men." Yeah, or all your friends could die. Do you want to risk that? No, I guess not. But I don't do closets very well, you know? I came out at conception. Promise to keep it to yourself. Yeah. Joey shifted sideways and walked his sneakers up the brick. So, the essential me. Ooh, I know what gift I'll get. I'll get a singer's gift. What's a singer's gift? Jason shrugged. Superhuman drug tolerance? Shut up!